Hello and welcome to Play Jazz Guitar Now. I'm Mel Reeves. Now, just as rock guitar can include many different types of performer, from Duane Eddy to Joe Satriani or from Frank Zappa to Mark Knopfler, so jazz guitar can include the sounds of Joe Pass, Jim Hall and Wes Montgomery on the one hand, and Pat Metheny, Larry Carlton and Scott Henderson on the other. There's trad jazz, mainstream, bebop, hard bop, modal jazz, atmospheric jazz and freeform, or to give it its more appropriate name, no form at all. And that's without mentioning the various types of fusion where jazz meets rock, reggae, dance and even country. The playwright Alan Plater once wrote that there are only three types of jazz: trad jazz, mainstream and when does the tune start. In this program we'll be looking mostly at the sounds associated with players like Joe Pass, Jimmy Rainey and Wes Montgomery, but we will take in the sounds of Miles Davis modal jazz and the sounds associated with some of today's fusion players. Essentially, we'll be learning how to create tension in music and how to release it using chords, scales and arpeggios. And as you will see, we'll achieve this without having to learn hundreds of chords and dozens of scales. We're going to think simple, but we'll be creating some very sophisticated sounds. So, let's tune up and get started. There seems to be some mystery surrounding so-called jazz chords, but the musical building blocks of jazz are the same as those used in virtually all other forms of music. There are major sounds, minor sounds, and seventh or dominant type sounds. Broadly speaking, the majors and the minors create points of rest, and the dominants suggest movement. The dominants provide tension, and the majors and minors release that tension. Jazz is all about controlling tension and release of tension. Before we actually get down to creating some of those sounds, we ought to look at what makes up what is probably the most important chord sequence in all jazz: the 2-5-1 progression. Now, 90% of music in the Western world is based upon the major scale: do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. These are the 12 major scales. Let's look at the scale of C major. As you can see, the notes in the key are C, D, E, F, G, A and B, and it all starts again with C. When playing a tune made up from the C scale, it's obviously sensible to use chords that are made from the same notes. And the 7 notes of the scale of C produce these 7 chords. In jazz, we add an extra note, still from the C scale, to each chord to produce these 7 chords. Now, should you want to know, these are called scale tone sevenths, and they're normally numbered using Roman numerals. So, in the key of C, the 1 chord is C major 7, the 2 chord, D minor 7, the 3rd is E minor 7, the 4 chord is F major 7, the 5 chord is G7, the 6 chord is A minor 7, and the 7 chord is B minor 7 with a flat 5. A 2-5-1 progression then in the key of C is D minor 7 to G7 to C. Here's a chart showing the scale tone sevenths found in each of the 12 major keys. We've highlighted the 2, the 5 and the 1 in each key. On this chart, we've just shown all 12 2-5-1 progressions. So, what's this got to do with playing jazz? Well, let's look at a jazz standard with a typical jazz chord sequence. Now, this sequence would fit several tunes, including Errol Garner's Misty. How many 2-5-1s or just 2-5s can you spot? A minor to D7 to G is 2-5-1 in the key of G. G minor 7 to C7 is 2-5 in the key of F. E minor 7 to A7 is 2-5 in the key of D. And sometimes there's a 1 chord in there too in the song. D major 7 is played. A flat minor 7 to D flat 7 is 2-5 in the key of G flat. F sharp minor 7 to B7 is 2-5 in the key of E. Virtually every bar in that chord sheet has a 2-5 chord sequence, or a 1 chord in it. The B minor 7 is the 6th chord in the key of D. We'll talk about chords 6 and 3 later. Clearly though, recognizing 2-5s, playing 2-5s, and being able to solo over 2-5s is a very big thing in jazz. Now, when you've learned how to play some 2-5s, which we're going to show you in a moment, you might want to come back and play the Misty chord sequence. We're going to learn some fingerings for playing the 2-5 sequence using another well-known jazz standard. We're going to look at a sequence that would fit Duke Ellington's Satin Doll. Before we get into it, let me just say a few words about jazz standards. Jazz musicians often play and record the same tunes over and over again. Now, this is not because they have a very small repertoire. It's just that some tunes, mostly popular songs of the 1930s and 40s, provide a particular challenge to the jazz musician. A song may have a large number of 2-5 chord sequences or other such problems. For the beginning jazz player, it can often be difficult to hear what the experienced jazz musician is doing. This is largely because he or she is not familiar with the original tune that's being treated to a chord and scale makeover. Even before any improvisation begins, many players embellish the original melody. They embellish it so much that it can be difficult to hear just what the real tune is. If you want to hear the original melodies of a large number of jazz standards, I can thoroughly recommend the so-called songbook series recorded by Ella Fitzgerald. Even though Ella swings like crazy and gives all the feeling of a jazz performance, backed by some great musicians, her recordings of the works of Cole Porter, George Gershwin, Duke Ellington, Rodgers and Hart, Jerome Kern and Harold Arlen allow you to hear the original melody clearly, and you'll soon understand how in other recordings musicians are working through and transforming the basic material. You'll also understand just why these tunes are played time and again. In order to learn some ways of playing the 2-5 chord sequence with proper jazz flavouring to the chords, we'll work through this sequence, which we'll call Ellington's Doll. Now, just to confuse you, whenever there's a 2-type chord, D minor 7 for example, you'll find that we don't simply play a D minor 7th. We play D minor 9th, D minor 11th, or some other minor 7th chord with extra colour added. But you should just learn them as 2-type chords. And whenever you see a 2 chord, use one of your favourites. There's no rule written in stone. The same is true for the 5 chord. I've used G 9th, G 13th, G7 with a sharp 5. Learn them all by heart. When you have a 2-5 type progression, you can use any of the 2 shapes followed by any of the 5 shapes. It's up to you to experiment and find your own favourites. There are 7 different 2-5s in this song to get your collection started, but there are lots more waiting to be discovered. Here's Ellington's Doll with the chord diagram shown on the screen the first time through. Okay, here it is one time for you to play through without me. Just a quick word here about what I'm doing with my right hand. My left hand's holding a D minor 9, and my right hand is fingering the 4 strings that my left hand is covering. And I'm playing it in a kind of punctuation kind of motion here. I could put a bass note first. I can mix those two things together. If you're a pick player, then you're going to want to strum. You could use pick and fingers, of course, which I always think of as just the same thing as fingerstyle. But if you are going to strum, there is a jazz strumming style very strongly associated with Freddie Green. And to do this, you do this. You strum the strings and stop pressing. Now obviously you've got to find your own way to do this kind of thing. The very best thing you can do first of all though is listen to as much jazz as possible. Listen to players like Joe Pass and Wes Montgomery to get that mainstream kind of sound. And listen to all the other players too. Maybe you like things like Jamiroquai and you want to hear the kind of rhythms that he plays. It's up to you to listen and learn. You could read all sorts of books about jazz rhythm and I could write down dozens and dozens of them. But really you'd probably only learn 1 or 2. The thing to do is to learn them over a period of time. And usually if you listen to records, if you go to performances, you'll be amazed at how much you pick up without even noticing it. Okay, let's move along now and look at some soloing. The chord sequence you just learned in Ellington's Dole contains 2 5s from several different keys. D minor G7 is from the key of C, E minor A7 is from the key of D. In fact, there are 2 5s from the keys of C, D, G, A flat and F. That's 5 different keys. Now this means that no one scale is going to fit over the top. So the very first thing that we must do in order to be able to solo over songs that pass through several different keys is learn a system of major scales that will enable us to change key rapidly as the chords sail by. In the case of Ellington's Dole, we must be able to change from C to D to G to A flat and so on. Now you may already know some ways of playing major scales. If you're a rock player, you probably know some 3-note per string scales and even know some modes. Now you're welcome to continue using those, but I'm going to show you a system of playing major scales that will enable you to play in 5 different keys at any one fret. It's called the caged system. There are 5 shapes to learn. Shape number 1 is based around this chord shape. So that wherever you find this chord, you find this scale. Here at the 3rd fret, we have C major. So we'll call this the C form. the A form. You might not be too familiar with this shape as a bar chord. This is the scale. Here's the G form. The E form is based around this E shape. It's a bit like a D, ordinary boring D chord played at the 2nd fret, but moved up now to be an E. And finally, the D form is based around this D shape. It's really like a C major moved up. Take your time to learn the 5 different scale forms exactly where I've shown them. That's with your first finger at the 2nd fret. That's 2nd position for all you classical players. Remember to say the name of both the chord and the scale as you play them. Okay, the guys are going to play our Ellington's Doll sequence now, and I'll just run up and down the scales using our cage system to play the scales of C, D, G, G flat and F. Before I do, don't think that I expect you to be able to do this in 5 minutes. It'll take time just to learn the scales, let alone be able to change from one form to another in time with the piece of music. Start learning your cage system now, and then we'll come back later and look at soloing further. Okay, here's Ellington's Doll. Well, so far things have probably seemed a bit theoretical, or we've been setting in motion things that will take some time to learn before you'll be able to use them freely. Here, though, we begin some of the fun bits that you can use right from the start. We're going to expand your chord knowledge without you having to learn any new chord shapes. We're going to learn diatonic chord substitution, and that simply means playing the wrong chord at the right time. Look at this chart. C major ninth has the notes C, E, G, B and D. E minor seventh contains E, G, B and D. So we could say that E minor seventh is a C major ninth chord without a C in it. If a bass player is playing the note C, then simply playing our E minor seventh will give us the sound of C major ninth. Likewise, a C sixth has C, E, G and A. A minor seventh is A, C, E and G. So from all this we can form a rule. Whenever we see a 1-type chord, we can play chords 3 or 6 as well. C major, E minor seventh and A minor seventh are interchangeable. Listen to this. chord 4 in a key is major 2. In the key of C, the 4 chord is F major. So, for the 4 chord, we simply pretend that it's a 1. F is the 1 chord in the key of F, and we can use chords 3 and 6 from the key of F as substitutes for F. So for F major 7, we now play A minor 7 and D minor 7. In fact, any A minor or D minor type chord. So we have one rule to learn for all major type chords. 1 equals 3 equals 6. Stop the tape now and try it for yourself. We can use a similar rule for the remaining chords in the key. Chord 2 equals chord 5 equals chord 7. Now in the key of C, that will mean that D minor 7 equals G7 equals B minor 7 flat 5. And using those two simple rules, a boring chord sequence like this one can have much more movement and interest for the listener and the player. I'll play it for you. Here are the first 4 bars of our Misty sequence. Here's one way of playing it. Now this can be overdone, but it's a very strong weapon to have in your armoury. Remember, we may only be playing and thinking simple chords, but the sounds we're producing are highly coloured 9ths, 11ths, 13ths and so on. Now just to show you that this is not restricted to jazz standards, here's a chord sequence the same as that found in Carole King's It's Too Late. The original sequence sets up a good groove, and we wouldn't want to fill the whole thing up with chords. But let's just use a little substitution. Now it would be a good idea at this point to find a song of your choice that doesn't have too many chord changes. And then you can try making use of our 2 substitution rules all over the place. Don't worry about taste. Now you'll find that this works better in some songs than in others. If you've learned some of the cage system, let's look at some soloing principles as we work through Ellington's Doll for the first few bars. And I'm going to start up here in the 7th position using the G form of the C major scale. Don't worry about which order I play the notes in when we start improvising. When we change to the D major scale, I'll use the A form of the D major. Let me try those two. Now before I move on and look at the next scale we're going to use, let's just look at how I'm playing those notes, what rhythms I'm using. So, starting with the C form again. And when I play the D scale, I'll use the same rhythm. You should be able to know what you've just played and copy yourself. Not necessarily exactly the same notes in exactly the same order when you're changing scales, but keep the rhythms. It'll make it sound like you know what you're doing. And you will be knowing what you're doing. Okay, let's move on to our next scale now. And this is going to be the D form of the G scale at the 7th fret. So we start with our C, the D, then the G. And we'll use the same form for the G flat. Be nice to play the same thing in the G and copy it in the G flat. Let's try that from the beginning. C. Then we end up back at C. But let's move, since we've already moved position, down here. That's the A form of the C scale. I'll play all of those again. So we start with C major up here, using the G form, D, the G, G flat, C. It'll take some time before you can change from one scale to the next and think about which notes you're going to play. But remember that rhythm is really important in jazz, probably more so than the choice of notes that you use. If you stick to the cage system, you'll always be playing the right notes. But it's what you do with those notes that's important. Fast notes, slow notes, copying yourself as you go, so that it's like a proper composition. If you listen to any tune, you get phrases, and then a phrase is repeated. And then you might get a holiday from the phrase, and then the phrase is repeated or just turned about a little towards the end. It's the same with a jazz solo. Another thing you can do is you can use the rhythm of the song that you're playing. So if you sing the song in your head as you play, don't play the notes of the tune, play the notes of the scales that go over the tune, but use the rhythm of the song. Now here's a substitution rule that's difficult to explain, but which is easy to apply. So if you find the theory a little bit difficult to understand, don't worry, because playing the substitution is going to be quite easy. But let's look at the theory first. Here are the notes of a D7 chord. Now, here are the notes of an A flat 7 chord. Notice that the third of the D7 chord, that's the F sharp, is the same note as the seventh of the A flat chord, which is G flat. Remember, G flat and F sharp are the same thing. Also, the seventh of the D7 chord is C, and that's the same as the third of the A flat 7 chord. Now, because they share what are considered to be the most important notes in a chord, the third and the seventh, we can substitute one chord for the other, and this is called tritone substitution. To find which chord will substitute for another using this rule, we have to refer to the musician's slide rule, the cycle of fifths or cycle of fourths. If you don't know this cycle, just let me say that this device has many uses. It can show you 2 5-1s, the number of sharps or flats in a key, and so on. But it will also show us tritone substitutions. So, to find a tritone substitution for G7, simply look immediately opposite the G for its substitution. And that should take you to D flat. Okay? For A7, it'll be E flat. And we play it as a 7, so it'll be E flat 7. It works the other way too, of course. E flat 7, its substitute will be A7. Now there is another way to use tritone substitution without referring to this chart. If we look at this 2-5-1 sequence, D minor, G7, C, if we use a tritone substitution for G7, we use D flat 7. So from this we can say that we can approach any chord from one fret above using a seventh or any dominant chord, and thinking this way, a sequence like C, A minor, D minor and G7 becomes this. So, although looked at one way, you might say that I'm using tritone substitution, and that sounds very impressive. What I'm really doing is approaching any given chord from one fret above using a dominant chord, 11th, 9th, 13th, so on. It becomes quite easy to do, but sounds quite complex. I prefer to call it semitone approach. Incidentally, if you're a fingerstyle player, you can bring out the bases of the tritone substitutions, and then it'll sound like this. Yes, I'm sure you recognize that sound. Okay, practice your tritone substitution for yourself. Playing chord tones as you solo is a very effective way of leading the listener through a chord sequence. Don't panic. You don't have to learn the names of all the notes in all the chords in all the gin joints in all the towns of the world. Nor do you have to learn a whole bunch of new arpeggio shapes. You already know enough to add chord tones to your solos. So let's suppose I'm soloing over this D major 7 chord, and I'm using the C major form of the D scale. As I solo, I can see this shape. I don't have to put my fingers down in the shape. I can just play those notes as I play through my scale. Now, as part of my solo, I could use even more chord tones, because I know several shapes of D major. Not special jazz shapes, Just ordinary D major shapes that everybody knows. Let's suppose that the chord changes to E minor, and I'm using the A form of the D scale. So we're up here, the chord changes to E minor, and I can see these notes before my eyes. I'll play the scale and put the chord in, or I could start on the chord notes, come down the scale. Now obviously it takes a little practice to be able to switch from scale tones to chord tones and back to scale tones again. Finding the appropriate shapes up and down the fingerboard will take a little thinking. So start now. How many minor shapes do you know? And where would you need to put them to make them A minor? Here are the basic major, minor and seventh shapes that can be moved up and down the fingerboard to produce the chord of your choice. The root of each one is clearly shown. When you begin to feel comfortable using chord tones and scales together, think about our chord substitution rules. Over my D major 7, I can also use the chord tones from F sharp minor and B minor. Think about it. Okay, time now to move on to my favourite part of the programme, where we really start to create those sounds that are unmistakably jazz. Sharp 9s, flat 9s, sharp 5s and flat 5s. Well, up to now we've been making some rather sweet and nice chord sounds, but none of those lovely crunchy sounds with a bit of dissonance that people imagine when they think of jazz. Well, here they come. The 5 chord, we said, is called the dominant. Essentially there are 2 types of dominant chord. One that goes where, in theory, it should go. That's chord 5 going to chord 1. G7 to C, E7 to A, F7 to B flat, so on. A dominant that actually goes to 1 is called a functioning dominant. A 5 chord that does not go to 1 is called a non-functioning dominant. Now, any dominant chord that goes to 1, a functioning dominant, can be made as tense as we like, because it's going to have that tension resolved by the 1 chord that follows it. G7, G9 and G13 only contain notes from the C scale, and they're not very tense. To make a dominant chord tense, we add notes that do not belong to the key we're playing in. G7 becomes G7 flat 5, that's got a D flat in it. It can be G7 sharp 5 with a D sharp in it. G7 flat 9, G7 sharp 9, any mixtures of sharp 9s and flat 5s can be used. For simplicity, most players use one name for them all, G7 altered. In a non-functioning situation, where chord 5 is not going to chord 1, then we only use the notes from the key we are in, giving us the dominants we've already learned in this program. That's 9ths, 11ths, 13ths. In a 2-5-1, the dominant is going home. It's a functioning dominant. Here then are some 2-5-1 sequences with altered dominants for you to learn. So let's get straight to the meaty bit, or the veggie bit for non-meat eaters. If an altered dominant chord is made up with notes that are not in our major scale system, what can we play over functioning dominants? Well, there is one scale that contains all of those lovely altered notes. Here are the notes in a G7 altered chord with all of the alterations. Now, these are the notes contained in the A-flat jazz minor scale. Well, from this, we can make a rule. Over any functioning dominant chord, whether it actually contains all of the alterations or not, we can play the jazz minor scale, whose root is 1 fret higher than our dominant. So that means for G7, we play A-flat jazz minor. So for C7, what would we play? Yeah, D-flat or C-sharp jazz minor. Here are some examples to give you the basic idea. Now you can either learn these phrases or start to make up some of your own. Well, now non-functioning dominants begin to sound very bland in the company of their more interesting relative. So to add a little spice to soloing over non-functioning dominants, we can also use the jazz minor, but we use one whose root is based on the fifth of the chord we're playing over. You can use your cycle of fifths to work this out. For example, for G7, non-functioning, we play D jazz minor. Clearly, knowing how to play the jazz minor scale is a very important thing. But of course, you're already trying to learn your cage system. So rather than learn lots and lots of different ways of playing the jazz minor, I recommend that you learn just one who has a root on the 6th string and one which has a root on the 5th string. And then you should be able to find any jazz minor that you want pretty much within reach of a short stretch up or down fingerboard. Okay, we'll leave you to do that. Then we'll come back and we'll talk about some more pieces to play. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in a short space of time. We've looked at scale tones sevenths, 2-5-1 chord progressions. We looked at how to play dominants, both functioning and non-functioning. We've got a scale system for soloing in any major key. And we've got a minor scale that we can use to play over dominant chords. That's quite a lot to take in. What you need to do now is just learn 1 or 2 bits of scale, chord, arpeggio, whatever, and make use of them. Don't try and learn everything at once, because the faster you force it into your brain, the sooner it will drop out. Playing these things has to become automatic, so that you can begin to feel things as you play and express what you're feeling. So that sounds a bit highfalutin, I know. Anyway, what we're going to do now is we have 3 tunes for you to play just with our band. When Charlie Parker was a young musician, he went on stage, it's rumoured, and was laughed off by the other musicians. He was so incensed at this, instead of giving up the saxophone altogether, he went away and he practiced. And he learned how to play I Got Rhythm, which was a very, very common tune then, and the sequence was used for lots of other songs. He learned how to play it in all 12 keys, and he made sure that he could solo over it in each key and not repeat himself. And he did the same with the 12-bar blues. So we've got I've Got Rhythm and a 12-bar blues for you to solo over coming up. On the screen you'll see chord shapes and you'll see scales that we're suggesting that you should use for soloing. And just for completeness, we've got a modal tune for you to try. Now, as you've probably gathered, I'm not a modal player, or at least I'm not a modal thinker. I think it's a cumbersome way of thinking. But we do have a tune that has just 2 chords in it, D minor and E flat minor. And since there isn't one single key that contains both of those chords, then you can't say that it's in the key of this or the key of that. So the way to look at it is to say, well, in which key can I find D minor? And you find you have 3 choices. For the E flat minor, you also have 3 choices. And it's up to you which one you use. So for the D minor, you could say D minor is the 2nd chord in the key of C, so I'll play the C scale. You could say that it's the 3rd chord in the key of B flat, so you play the B flat scale. Or it's the 6th chord in the key of F, so you play the F scale. Now essentially what you'll be doing is playing modes. You'll be playing D Dorian, D Phrygian, and you'll also be playing D Aeolian. But you don't need to think that. You just need to know which key D minor is included in and play the appropriate scale. Anyway, we'll leave you to play that by yourself. You can stretch out a little bit on something that's only got 1 chord in it, so you can experiment with some of our chord substitutions. What would substitute for D minor? Yes, there's a thought. If it's in the key of F, what chords would substitute for D minor? Well, F would for a start. I'll leave you to work on that one. Go back and have a look at our substitution rules, and you'll soon find a wonderful list of chords that you can play instead of any other chord. Here are our tunes then, and I hope you enjoy them.